Marie Taylor's first day as the new police captain of Silverbrook was supposed to be uneventful, at least by her standards. A small, predominantly white town nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, Silverbrook prided itself on its peaceful reputation, a code word that masked decades of unresolved racial tensions and unspoken divides. For years, the town's police department had operated with an unspoken, good old boys culture, resistant to change and protective of its own. When Marie was appointed as the first black woman to lead the force, it sent ripples through the community. Some were hopeful, others were quietly enraged. Marie had earned her position through years of dedication and a spotless record, but that didn't stop the whispers. Affirmative action hire, she'd overheard someone mutter during her swearing-in ceremony. It didn't faze her. She'd faced worse in her career. What mattered to her was proving that justice wasn't about race, gender, or politics, it was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. The morning was chilly as Marie stepped into the station. The precinct's main floor buzzed with activity, phones ringing, officers typing up reports, and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the corner. She greeted the desk sergeant with a polite smile, noting the barely concealed skepticism in his eyes. Her office was at the back, a modest room with a wooden desk and a single window overlooking the parking lot. As she placed her nameplate on the desk, she took a deep breath. Change was never easy, but she wasn't here to make friends, she was here to lead. Meanwhile, across the station, Officer Brian Harris was wrapping up his shift. A veteran of the force, Brian had been with the department for nearly 2 decades. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always carrying a smug grin, he had built a reputation as a no-nonsense cop who got results. Beneath that veneer, however, was a man who wielded his badge like a weapon, often targeting the town's minority population under the guise of upholding the law. To Brian, the appointment of Marie Taylor was a slap in the face, a sign that the department was caving to political correctness. He'd made up his mind the moment he heard her name, she wouldn't last 6 months. It was during his patrol that Brian spotted Angela Robinson walking into the corner store. Angela was a 28-year-old single mother who lived in the predominantly black neighborhood on the outskirts of town. She'd had a few minor run-ins with the law in her youth, nothing serious, but enough for someone like Brian to mark her as trouble. Watching her through his rearview mirror, he smirked. "Let's see what she's up to," he muttered to himself. Inside the store, Angela was picking up groceries for her 2 young children. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet and had little time to worry about the likes of Brian Harris. As she approached the counter to pay, Brian entered the store, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere. The cashier, an older man named Frank, nodded nervously at Brian, who made a show of walking the aisles as if inspecting for crime. Angela felt his eyes on her, but she kept her head down, refusing to engage. As she exited the store, Brian followed her to the parking lot. "Hey, Angela," he called out, his tone falsely friendly. She stopped and turned, clutching her grocery bag tightly. "What's in the bag?" he asked, gesturing toward her items. Angela frowned. "Groceries." "Why?" Brian chuckled. "Mind if I take a look?" "Just a routine check." Angela hesitated but knew better than to argue. "Go ahead," she said, handing him the bag. He rifled through it, pulling out a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a pack of diapers. "All clear," he said, handing it back with a smirk. "Have a nice day." Angela drove home, seething. She'd been through this kind of thing before, stopped, searched, and treated like a suspect for no reason other than the color of her skin. But what she didn't know was that Brian wasn't done with her yet. Back at the station, Brian was logging his shift report when he got an idea. He'd noticed a security camera near the corner store's entrance and decided to use it to his advantage. With a few clicks, he accessed the footage and began editing it to make it look like Angela had slipped a small item into her bag without paying. It wasn't the first time he'd pulled a stunt like this, and he doubted it would be the last. To him, it was just another way to keep the streets clean. The next morning, Marie received her first major case as captain, a shoplifting report involving Angela Robinson. According to the file, the security footage clearly showed her taking an item without paying. Something about the report didn't sit right with Marie. The evidence seemed too convenient, too neatly packaged. She decided to review the footage herself. As she watched the grainy video, Marie's sharp eyes caught something unusual. The timestamp on the footage didn't align with the store's operating hours. Suspicious, she called the store's owner, Frank, who confirmed that the footage had been altered. "I didn't report anything stolen," he added, his voice shaky. "I don't want any trouble." Marie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just a case of shoplifting, it was something much darker. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she called Angela in for questioning. When Angela arrived at the station, she was visibly nervous but cooperative. Marie introduced herself and assured Angela that she was only there to gather information. As Angela recounted her encounter with Brian, Marie's suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't about stolen goods, it was about a power-hungry cop abusing his authority. Marie knew she had to tread carefully. Brian was well liked by certain factions within the department, and accusing him of misconduct without solid proof could backfire. But she also knew she couldn't let this slide. "Not on my watch," she thought to herself. The day ended with Marie poring over files, making notes, and preparing for what she knew would be a long, uphill battle. She didn't know how deep the corruption went, but she was determined to root it out, no matter the cost. As she turned off the lights in her office, she couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and resolve. This wasn't just about Angela Robinson, it was about justice, integrity, and the kind of town Silverbrook could become if it faced its demons head-on. Little did she know, the storm brewing within the department would soon spill into the streets, forcing everyone, officers and citizens alike, to confront the truth about the people sworn to protect them. For Marie, it was the beginning of a fight that would define her career and forever change the town she had sworn to serve. Marie arrived at the precinct early the next morning, her mind racing with questions. The case against Angela Robinson seemed flimsy, but it wasn't just the lack of evidence that troubled her. It was the uneasy feeling that the entire situation had been engineered. Years of experience had honed her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. This wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. But proving that would require more than a hunch, it would take evidence, patience, and the ability to navigate the political minefield of a department deeply resistant to change. The station was unusually quiet, save for the hum of computers and the occasional shuffle of papers. Marie could feel the weight of suspicion and resistance from her officers. She was the outsider, the disruptor, the one who represented a challenge to the status quo. As she walked through the bullpen, heads turned just enough to show they were watching her, but not enough to appear obvious. She felt their unease, their skepticism, and in some cases, their outright hostility. It only steeled her resolve. Her first task was to gather more information about the supposed theft. The report filed by Brian Harris painted Angela as a habitual offender, someone who had been caught and released multiple times due to lenient policies. But a deeper look into Angela's record showed a different story. Yes, there were a few minor infractions, a noise complaint, a late parking ticket, but nothing to suggest a pattern of criminal behavior. If anything, it seemed like Angela was someone trying to stay under the radar, not someone actively causing trouble. Marie decided to review the surveillance footage again, this time frame by frame. She noticed subtle inconsistencies, shadows that didn't align, a jitter in the video that suggested tampering. She jotted down her observations and made a mental note to get an expert's opinion. This wasn't just sloppy police work, it was deliberate manipulation. Her investigation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Officer Greg Williams, one of the younger members of the force, stepped in hesitantly. Greg had joined the department a few years ago, and though he mostly kept to himself, Marie had pegged him as someone with potential. "Captain, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice low. Marie gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Officer Williams?" Greg hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "It's about the Robinson case. Something doesn't feel right." Marie leaned forward. "Go on." "I was the first officer on the scene," Greg began. "I responded to a call about a suspicious person, but when I got there, everything seemed fine. Angela wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. She was just loading groceries into her car. I wrote it off as a false alarm, but then Harris showed up. He told me to leave and that he'd handle it." Marie's eyes narrowed. "Did he say why?" Greg shook his head. "No, but it didn't sit well with me. Then, the next thing I know, there's this report about her shoplifting, and it doesn't add up. I didn't see her take anything, and neither did the store owner." "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Marie asked, though she already knew the answer. Greg looked down at his hands. "You know how it is. Harris has been here forever. He's got the ear of the brass, and people don't question him. But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't right." Marie nodded. "Thank you for coming to me. Your instincts are good, and you did the right thing by speaking up. But I need more. Can you help me dig deeper?" Greg hesitated but eventually nodded. "Yeah. I'll do what I can." As Greg left, Marie felt a glimmer of hope. Not everyone in the department was complicit, and that meant she had allies, however tentative. Her next move was to speak with Angela directly. She arranged for Angela to come to the station under the guise of following up on the case. When Angela arrived, she looked wary but composed. Marie greeted her warmly and invited her into her office. "Ms. Robinson, I know you've been through a lot in the past few days," Marie began. "I want you to know that I'm here to get to the truth. I have some questions about what happened at the store." Angela hesitated before nodding. "All right. What do you want to know?" Marie leaned forward. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember about that day." Angela recounted her morning in meticulous detail, waking up early to get the kids ready for school, stopping by the store to pick up essentials, and her encounter with Brian in the parking lot. Her voice wavered as she described the humiliation of being searched in public, but she held her composure. "What about the store owner? Did he say anything to you?" Marie asked. Angela shook her head. "No. Frank's a quiet guy. He just rang me up like usual. I don't think he'd call the cops on me. He knows me. I've been shopping there for years." Marie made a note of that. It aligned with what Greg had said. "One last question. Did Officer Harris say anything unusual to you?" Angela hesitated, her brow furrowing. "He said something about keeping an eye on me. Like I was some kind of criminal." Marie thanked Angela for her time and assured her that the investigation was ongoing. As Angela left, Marie felt a mix of anger and determination. Brian's actions weren't just unethical, they were personal. He had targeted Angela because he could, because he thought no one would question him. But he hadn't counted on her. Back at her desk, Marie began piecing together the puzzle. She contacted a forensic analyst to examine the video footage and confirm her suspicions of tampering. She also started looking into Brian's past cases, searching for patterns. What she found was disturbing. Over the years, Brian had been involved in numerous incidents that raised red flags: excessive force complaints, discrepancies in reports, and cases where evidence mysteriously went missing or appeared out of nowhere. Yet, he had never faced serious consequences. The department's internal review process was a joke, and his superiors had turned a blind eye, either out of loyalty or fear. Marie knew she was walking a fine line. Going after Brian would mean taking on the entrenched culture of the department, and that was a battle she couldn't win alone. She needed allies, both inside and outside the precinct. The following day, Marie called a meeting with her command staff. She presented the evidence she had gathered so far, careful not to point fingers just yet. "There are inconsistencies in this case that need to be addressed," she said, her tone firm. "We owe it to the community to ensure that justice is served, and that means holding ourselves to the highest standards." The room was silent. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided her gaze. Brian, sitting near the back, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, "you're new here. Maybe you don't understand how things work in Silverbrook." Marie met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "You're right, Officer Harris. I'm new. But I don't think it takes a lifetime in Silverbrook to know the difference between right and wrong." The tension in the room was palpable as the meeting adjourned. Marie knew she had made an enemy of Brian, but she also knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about one case or one officer, it was about the soul of the department and the community it served. As she walked back to her office, Marie felt the weight of the challenge ahead. But she also felt a flicker of hope. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. And she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. Marie sat in her office late into the evening, her desk buried under stacks of files and her laptop displaying the edited surveillance footage. The forensic analyst she had contacted earlier had confirmed her suspicions. The timestamp on the footage had been altered, and there were signs of splicing, likely to insert fabricated evidence. It was damning proof, but it wasn't enough. If she was going to hold Brian Harris accountable, she needed to build an airtight case, one that couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding or, worse, a vendetta. The precinct was nearly empty by the time she stood to stretch. She stepped out of her office, the quiet hum of the station amplifying her every move. Most of the officers had gone home for the day, but as she made her way to the break room for a fresh cup of coffee, she heard faint voices from a nearby hallway. Pausing, she moved closer, recognizing Brian's deep, gruff tone. "Look, I don't care what she thinks she's doing," Brian was saying. "She's not one of us, and she never will be. She can dig all she wants, but this department has been running just fine without her reforms." Marie's blood boiled, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to confront him. Instead, she retreated to her office, her resolve hardening. Brian's arrogance was his weakness. He believed he was untouchable, and that overconfidence would be his undoing. The next morning, Marie called Greg Williams into her office. The young officer looked nervous but determined as he took a seat across from her desk. "Officer Williams, I need your help," Marie began. "You were there the day this supposed shoplifting incident happened. Your testimony could be crucial." Greg hesitated. "Captain, I want to do the right thing, but if I speak out against Harris, my career here is over." Marie leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Greg, I won't sugarcoat this. Standing up to someone like Brian Harris isn't easy. But if we don't hold him accountable, this department will never change. And if we don't change, we're failing the very people we've sworn to protect." Greg looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to write a detailed statement about everything you witnessed that day. Be honest, and don't leave anything out." "I'll make sure it's handled appropriately," Marie said. "And Greg, if you feel unsafe or pressured, you come to me immediately." Greg nodded, his jaw tightening. "All right. I'll do it." As Greg left, Marie felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were good officers in the department, people who wanted to do the right thing, even if it came at a cost. But she knew they would need more than courage, they would need proof. Over the next few days, Marie worked tirelessly to gather evidence. She contacted Frank, the store owner, and convinced him to provide a written statement confirming that he had not reported any theft. She also reached out to community members who had had previous run-ins with Brian. Many were hesitant to speak out, afraid of retaliation, but a few agreed to share their stories anonymously. Patterns began to emerge: vague reports, questionable arrests, and a trail of complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from the department's records. Marie also took a closer look at Brian's history within the department. She discovered that he had been disciplined multiple times early in his career for minor infractions, falsifying reports, using excessive force, but each time, the cases had been quietly closed. It was clear he had friends in high places, people who had protected him and allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. The breakthrough came when Marie reviewed the department's digital records. With the help of an IT specialist, she uncovered metadata from the altered surveillance footage. The edits had been made using a department-issued laptop, Brian's laptop. It was the smoking gun she needed, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to simply present the evidence. Brian's allies would argue it was a mistake or claim the laptop had been used by someone else. She needed a confession. Marie decided to confront Brian directly. She called him into her office, locking the door behind him. He sauntered in with his usual smug grin, clearly unconcerned. "What can I do for you, Captain?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. Marie wasted no time. "I know what you did, Brian. The surveillance footage, the false report, it's all going to come out." Brian's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone dismissive. "If you're accusing me of something, you'd better have proof." Marie slid a folder across the desk. "I have plenty of proof. Altered footage, fabricated reports, a history of misconduct that's been buried for years. The question isn't whether you'll be held accountable, Brian, it's whether you'll take the fall alone or drag others down with you." Brian's face darkened. "You think you can come in here and change how things work? You don't know this town, Taylor. People like you don't last here." Marie stood, her gaze steady. "Maybe not. But I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the truth. You have a choice, Brian. Cooperate and face the consequences, or fight me and lose everything. Either way, your days of abusing your badge are over." For a moment, Brian said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "You're making a mistake, Captain. You don't know who you're dealing with." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Marie sat back down, her heart pounding. She knew Brian wasn't bluffing. He had allies within the department and likely within the town's power structure. But she also knew she was closer than ever to exposing the truth. Later that evening, Marie received a call from Greg. His voice was shaky as he spoke. "Captain, I think you should know, Harris is trying to rally support against you. He's telling people you're out to ruin the department." Marie sighed. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. "Thanks for letting me know, Greg. Stay vigilant, and don't let him intimidate you. We're going to see this through." As she hung up, Marie knew the fight was far from over. Brian wasn't just going to roll over and accept defeat. He would dig in, use every connection he had, and fight back with everything he could muster. But Marie wasn't backing down either. This was about more than one corrupt officer, it was about justice, accountability, and the future of the department. The storm brewing within the precinct was about to reach its breaking point, and when it did, the entire town would be forced to confront the truth about the people they trusted to protect them. The morning after her confrontation with Brian Harris, Marie arrived at the precinct to find a tense atmosphere. Conversations stopped as she walked through the bullpen, and officers avoided her gaze. Whispers of her investigation had clearly spread, and the lines were being drawn. Brian's allies were circling the wagons, while the few officers who supported her remained silent, caught between loyalty to their captain and fear of retaliation. Marie felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she pushed forward. The truth was too important to let intimidation sway her. Greg Williams met her at her office door, his expression grave. "Captain, we need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Marie motioned for him to sit. "What's going on?" Greg handed her a folder, his hand trembling slightly. "This is everything I could find on Harris's past cases. I pulled files from storage that weren't in the digital system. There's a pattern. He's been targeting specific people, mostly minorities and low-income residents. It's not random." Marie flipped through the folder, her anger mounting with each page. The cases were all eerily similar: vague charges, questionable evidence, and suspects who were pressured into plea deals or quietly released with no explanation. The victims' names blurred together, but one detail stood out. Many of them had complained about Harris's behavior, only to have their grievances dismissed or ignored. "This is solid, Greg," Marie said, closing the folder. "But it's not enough. We need a direct link between Harris and the tampered evidence." Greg hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I think I know someone who can help. There's an officer who left the department a few years ago, James Waller. He worked with Harris for over a decade. If anyone knows where the skeletons are buried, it's him." Marie nodded. "Do you have a way to reach him?" "I can get his number," Greg said. "But I don't know if he'll talk. He left under complicated circumstances." "Let me worry about that," Marie said. "Get me his contact information." Later that day, Marie sat in her car outside a modest suburban house, staring at the address Greg had given her. James Waller's name was etched on the mailbox, but the house itself looked worn, its paint peeling and the lawn overgrown. Marie took a deep breath and stepped out of her car. She had no idea what kind of reception she would get, but she had to try. When James answered the door, he looked like a man who had been through the ringer. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. He regarded Marie with suspicion but stepped aside when she introduced herself. "I'm not sure why you're here, Captain," James said, leading her to a cluttered living room. "I've been out of the game for a while." "I'm investigating Brian Harris," Marie said bluntly. "I believe he's been fabricating evidence and abusing his authority for years. I was told you might have information that could help." James laughed bitterly. "Brian Harris. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. That man is poison, Captain. He always has been." Marie leaned forward. "Then help me stop him. I know it's risky, but if we don't hold him accountable, he'll keep hurting people." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know what you're asking. I tried to blow the whistle on him once, years ago. All it got me was a ruined career and a target on my back." "What happened?" Marie asked. James hesitated, then began to speak. He told her about a case from a decade ago, when he and Brian had been partners. They had responded to a domestic disturbance call, and Brian had arrested the husband on flimsy charges. James had later discovered that Brian had planted drugs in the man's car to justify the arrest. When James confronted him, Brian had laughed it off, saying it was necessary to keep people like the suspect in line. James had reported the incident to their superiors, but instead of taking action, they had swept it under the rug. Brian's friends in high places had protected him, and James had been branded a troublemaker. The stress and isolation had eventually driven him to leave the force. "I couldn't fight the system," James said, his voice heavy with regret. "But if you're serious about taking him down, I'll help you. Just tell me what you need." Marie felt a surge of gratitude. "I need you to make a statement, detailing everything you just told me. And I need you to testify, if it comes to that." James nodded slowly. "All right. But you'd better be ready for the fallout. Harris won't go down without a fight." Back at the precinct, Marie began assembling her case. She now had Greg's statement, James's testimony, the altered footage, and the tampered records. But she knew she needed to act quickly. Brian would catch wind of her progress soon, if he hadn't already. Her fears were confirmed later that afternoon when she received an anonymous tip. A caller, using a disguised voice, warned her to back off or face the consequences. Marie hung up, her resolve only hardening. Fear tactics wouldn't work on her. That evening, Marie met with Angela Robinson to update her on the case. Angela listened intently as Marie explained the evidence she had gathered and the next steps. When Marie finished, Angela looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "Captain, I want to help," Angela said. "If there's anything I can do, just tell me." "You've already been through so much," Marie said gently. "You don't have to do anything more." Angela shook her head. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone Brian has hurt. If my voice can make a difference, I'm willing to speak up." Marie felt a deep respect for Angela's courage. "Thank you," she said. "Your testimony will be invaluable." The next day, Marie presented her findings to the district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda Chavez. Linda reviewed the evidence carefully, her expression growing grimmer by the minute. "This is serious," Linda said, looking up from the files. "If we move forward with this, it's going to shake the department to its core." "It needs to be done," Marie said firmly. "The people of this town deserve better." Linda nodded. "All right. I'll start preparing the case. But you'd better be ready, Captain. This isn't going to be a clean fight." Marie left the DA's office feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The wheels of justice were finally turning, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Brian and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight, and the fallout could be devastating. But Marie was ready. She had come to Silverbrook to make a difference, and she wasn't going to back down now. As she drove back to the precinct, Marie couldn't help but think about the larger implications of the case. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop, it was about a culture that had allowed him to thrive. If she succeeded, it could be a turning point for the entire community. But if she failed, it would send a message that change was impossible. Marie parked her car and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she stepped out and walked into the precinct, ready to face whatever came next. The day of reckoning arrived faster than Marie expected. News of her investigation had spread through the precinct like wildfire, and the tension was palpable. Officers who had once been polite now kept their distance, while Brian's loyalists whispered in corners and exchanged knowing glances whenever Marie passed by. She ignored them, focusing instead on the final preparations for what would be one of the most challenging days of her career. Marie's office was a hive of activity. Greg Williams worked quietly at his desk, reviewing the compiled evidence, while Angela Robinson sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly as she rehearsed her statement. James Waller, summoned from his self-imposed exile, paced the room, his anxiety visible but controlled. Each of them had played a crucial role in uncovering the truth, and now they would stand together to expose the corruption that had plagued the department for years. The district attorney, Linda Chavez, arrived just before noon, flanked by 2 assistants. She carried a briefcase full of legal documents and wore an expression of unflinching resolve. "Captain Taylor," she said as she entered Marie's office, "it's time." Marie nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She glanced at her team, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Let's do this." The meeting room was filled with officers, some seated, others standing along the walls. Brian Harris sat near the center, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and calculating. He smirked when Marie entered, as if daring her to proceed. Marie ignored him, walking to the front of the room where Linda stood waiting. "Thank you all for coming," Linda began, her voice calm but authoritative. "We're here to address serious allegations regarding misconduct within this department. These allegations are backed by evidence and testimony that demand our attention." The room erupted into murmurs, but Linda raised her hand, silencing the crowd. "Before we proceed, I want to emphasize that these matters are not being taken lightly. This is about accountability and ensuring that the people of Silverbrook can trust the men and women who have sworn to protect them." Marie stepped forward, her heart pounding. For those of you who may not be aware, this investigation began after an incident involving Angela Robinson, who was falsely accused of shoplifting. Evidence was fabricated to justify her arrest, and further investigation has revealed a pattern of similar misconduct. She gestured toward the screen behind her, where images of altered surveillance footage and falsified reports appeared. This footage was tampered with using a department-issued laptop, and the discrepancies were confirmed by a forensic analyst. Brian shifted in his seat, his smirk fading as whispers filled the room. "This is ridiculous," he said loudly. "You're trying to smear my name with baseless accusations." Marie met his gaze. "The evidence speaks for itself, Officer Harris. And we're not done." Greg Williams stood, his voice steady despite the tension. "I was present during the incident with Angela Robinson. I witnessed Officer Harris manipulating the situation to justify her arrest. It wasn't the first time I've seen behavior like this, but it will be the last." James Waller was next. He recounted his experiences with Brian, his voice heavy with emotion but unwavering. "I tried to report him years ago, but the system failed me. Now, I'm here to make sure it doesn't fail again." The room fell silent as Angela rose to speak. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I was humiliated, treated like a criminal for something I didn't do. If Captain Taylor hadn't believed in me, I don't know where I'd be. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's been wronged and ignored." Brian stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is a witch hunt. You're all out to get me because I've done what needed to be done to keep this town safe." Linda stepped forward, her tone icy. "Officer Harris, this isn't about safety. It's about abuse of power and betrayal of trust. You're entitled to due process, but the evidence against you is overwhelming." Marie felt a flicker of triumph as Brian's bluster faltered. But the battle wasn't over yet. The department would need to decide how to proceed, and Brian's allies wouldn't go down without a fight. The meeting ended with a decision to place Brian on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. It was a significant step, but Marie knew it was just the beginning. The DA's office would continue to build its case, and the department would need to confront its own complicity in allowing Brian's behavior to persist for so long. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the precinct remained tense. Some officers supported Marie openly, while others resented her for exposing the department's flaws. But there was also a sense of hope, a belief that change was possible, even in the face of resistance. Angela Robinson became a vocal advocate for accountability, her story inspiring others to come forward. James Waller, rejuvenated by his involvement in the case, began working with community leaders to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. And Greg Williams, emboldened by his role in the investigation, emerged as a leader among his peers. As for Brian, he continued to protest his innocence, but the evidence against him was undeniable. His trial would be a turning point not just for him, but for the entire town of Silverbrook. It would force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the responsibility of those who wear the badge. One evening, as Marie sat in her office, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, Greg knocked on the door. "Captain," he said, "I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up for what's right. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Marie smiled, feeling a rare moment of peace. "It's not just me, Greg. It's all of us. Change doesn't happen overnight, but we're moving in the right direction." As Greg left, Marie looked out the window at the town she had come to call home. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, she felt a sense of possibility. Silverbrook wasn't perfect, but it was worth fighting for. And fight she would, for as long as it took. The trial of Brian Harris became a spectacle that gripped the town of Silverbrook. The courtroom was packed on the first day, with reporters, community members, and off-duty officers filling every available seat. It was a landmark case, not just because of the charges against Brian but because of what it symbolized, a reckoning for a system that had enabled corruption and abuse for far too long. Marie sat in the front row, her presence a silent declaration of her commitment to justice. She felt the weight of the community's expectations pressing down on her shoulders, but she also felt their hope. Angela Robinson was beside her, a pillar of quiet strength. Behind them were Greg Williams, James Waller, and a few other officers who had chosen to stand on the side of integrity. Together, they represented a fragile but growing coalition of those who believed in accountability. The prosecution, led by Linda Chavez, presented its case with meticulous precision. Linda began by outlining the charges against Brian: evidence tampering, false arrests, and abuse of power. She then methodically walked the jury through the evidence, starting with the altered surveillance footage from Angela's case. Expert witnesses testified about the tampering, explaining how timestamps had been manipulated and key frames deleted to frame Angela for a crime she didn't commit. Next came the testimony of Greg Williams. Greg's voice was steady as he recounted the events of the day Angela was arrested. He described Brian's manipulation of the situation, his dismissal of Angela's protests, and his cavalier attitude toward the truth. "I've served with many officers in my career," Greg said, looking directly at the jury. "But Brian Harris is the only one who made me question the values we're supposed to uphold." James Waller was the prosecution's star witness. His testimony was a damning indictment of Brian's long history of misconduct. James described the case that had driven him to leave the force, detailing how Brian had planted drugs on an innocent man and then laughed about it. He spoke of the fear and isolation he had felt when he tried to report Brian, only to be stonewalled by the department. "I left because I couldn't fight him alone," James said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I'm here now because no one should have to face what I did." Angela Robinson's testimony was equally powerful. She described the humiliation and fear she had felt when she was falsely arrested, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not the first person Brian Harris has hurt," she said, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "But I want to be the last." The defense attempted to discredit the witnesses, painting Greg as a disgruntled subordinate, James as a bitter former officer, and Angela as an opportunist. But Linda was relentless in her cross-examinations, dismantling the defense's arguments with facts and logic. She emphasized the consistency of the witnesses' accounts and the overwhelming evidence of Brian's misconduct. As the trial progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The initial tension gave way to a sense of inevitability. The prosecution's case was airtight, and Brian's smirks and bravado began to fade. He grew visibly agitated, his confidence eroding with each damning piece of evidence presented. The most dramatic moment came when Linda introduced a surprise witness, a young man named Marcus, one of Brian's previous victims. Marcus had been arrested by Brian years earlier on fabricated charges, his life derailed by the experience. "I lost my job, my reputation, and my sense of safety," Marcus testified, his voice trembling with anger and pain. "All because of one man's lies." Brian's lawyer objected, arguing that Marcus's testimony was irrelevant to the current case, but the judge allowed it, citing its relevance to establishing a pattern of behavior. Marcus's words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the human cost of Brian's actions. When it was finally Brian's turn to testify, his demeanor was a far cry from the cocky arrogance he had displayed at the precinct. He denied the allegations, of course, but his explanations were evasive and inconsistent. Under cross-examination, Linda pressed him relentlessly, exposing the holes in his story and forcing him to confront the evidence against him. By the time the closing arguments were made, it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that the prosecution had built an unassailable case. Linda's final words were a powerful call to action. This trial is about more than one man's actions. It's about the values we hold as a community. Do we stand for justice, or do we turn a blind eye to abuse? The choice is yours. The jury deliberated for 3 days, during which Silverbrook held its breath. Rumors swirled, and debates erupted in coffee shops, diners, and homes. Some people still defended Brian, clinging to the belief that he was a good cop who had been unfairly targeted. But many others saw the trial as a turning point, a chance to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better from their police force. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed once again. The jury foreman rose, his expression solemn. "We find the defendant, Brian Harris, guilty on all counts." The room erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Brian slumped in his seat, his face pale and his hands trembling. Marie felt a surge of relief and vindication, but also a deep sadness. The verdict was a victory, but it came at a cost. The trust between the police and the community had been deeply fractured, and it would take years to repair. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial continued to ripple through Silverbrook. Several other officers who had covered for Brian or engaged in similar misconduct were placed under investigation. The department began implementing reforms, including mandatory ethics training, increased oversight, and a new system for handling complaints. Angela Robinson became a prominent voice for police accountability, speaking at town hall meetings and advocating for systemic change. James Waller found a renewed sense of purpose, working with community organizations to rebuild trust between residents and law enforcement. Greg Williams was promoted to sergeant, his courage and integrity recognized by both his peers and his superiors. As for Marie, she remained captain of the Silverbrook Police Department, more determined than ever to create a culture of transparency and accountability. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew it was worth it. The trial had been a turning point, but it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. One evening, as Marie walked through the streets of Silverbrook, she was approached by a young girl who shyly handed her a handwritten note. It read, "Thank you for making our town better." Marie smiled, her resolve strengthened by the simple gesture. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. And for Silverbrook, the journey toward justice had just begun.